But let me begin by expressing my appreciation to the Grace Kennedy Foundation for affording me the opportunity and the privilege of giving the 1991 lecture. The opportunity to present to an audience such as this a number of contemporary issues of vital interest, and the privilege of following two eminent persons, the Honorable Arthur Brown and Mr. Alistair McIntyre, who gave the first two lectures in this series. It was sometime during last year that I was invited to give this lecture, but it now seems that an age has passed since that time. The world has changed tremendously. We have witnessed a series of extraordinary events, some of them unprecedented, some of them totally unexpected. These events have come swiftly, crowding one another and acting seemingly in an endless chain. And with all this has come new phrases or echoes of old ones from the past. Phrases such as the new Europe, a common European home, the Pacific Rim, the peace dividend, an era of peace and prosperity, holy war, deregulation, sustainable development, and in particular, a new world order. The impact of these events has been magnified considerably by the magic of the new communications technologies, which have transmitted them rapidly across the world, triggering quite often actions and reactions in different parts of the globe. One result of all this has been the growing realization that regardless of the differences in their characteristics or their conditions, their race, their culture, their language, economic or political circumstances, the people of this planet are being drawn closer together, their fate, their future more and more linked, their lives more and more affected by each other's actions. And so we have seen the dramatic events of late 1989 amounting to a virtual revolution in the Soviet Union and other countries of Eastern Europe. We have from a distance witnessed the fantastic episode in China, the Peking Spring, when demonstrations in favor of democracy commanded the attention and sympathy of much of the world, only to end in tragedy in Tiananmen Square in June 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 symbolized the disappearance of the Iron Curtain as the revolution in reverse rolled forward, sweeping away the dominance of the communist parties in Eastern Europe. The year 1990 saw the liberation of Namibia, the freeing of Nelson Mandela after 27 years of imprisonment, and the gradual dismantling of elements of the system of apartheid in South Africa. We had our share of turbulence in the Caribbean. In Trinidad and Tobago, the Prime Minister, ministers of government, and members of Parliament were held hostage and terrorized in the Parliament building for several days. These events elicited a great wave of sympathy and deep concern for the security of Caribbean countries. And Haiti, after a great deal of difficulty, at last elected a president and seemed ready to join the march to democracy. What we have been witnessing then, in these times, is the re-emergence of Western Europe with its potential for becoming, again, a major force in world affairs, the rapprochement between East and West, the decline in the power of the USSR, leaving the world with a single superpower, and the assertion of the military might of the United States. All these pointing to the possible shape of a new order in the affairs of the world. Yet I believe that this is only a part of the picture, for there are other developments which have been taking place, many of them in the third world, which in the final analysis could have as much influence or more on the shaping of a world order. As we enter the last decade of the millennium, and as we face the prospects ahead of us, we must give full attention to these matters, to understand their meaning and significance for our communities, if we are to find the means to meet the coming challenges and opportunities. A new world order is in fact emerging, but its final form, its character, is likely to differ in many respects from the new world order envisaged by the leaders of the Western world. I think that there's much that we in the Caribbean can learn from the experience of the European countries as they have moved increasingly closer in their move to the single market. That movement has been attended by considerable difficulties and differences. They have had serious disagreements about farm subsidies, about the establishment of a European monetary system and a central bank, and about the proposal for an extension of the relationship to include common foreign policy and defense policy. But what is perhaps most important are the determination, the spirit of compromise, and the creative effort which have gone into the building of this new European community. Inevitably, a number of other countries, members of the European Free Trade Association, and some of the Eastern European countries wish to join the Europeans in the single market, but this will take time. Caribbean countries have been concerned, of course, about some of the issues involved in the move to the single market. They are concerned in particular about the region's exports to Europe, products such as sugar, rum, bananas, citrus, rice, and manufactured goods. They're concerned about the tourist industry and the prospects in regard to investment flows and development aid. Caribbean sugar enjoys a quota under the Lomé Agreement, which is shared with some countries of Africa and the Pacific. Our difficulties center around the question of the price we receive, as well as the possibility that the call for a reduction in farm subsidies in the Uruguay round of World Trade negotiations under the GATT could put the continued existence of the sugar protocol in jeopardy. In the case of bananas, we will have to face competition from other sources. Producers, some of whom export fruit judged to be of higher quality than ours. Here again, we receive protection along with the other ACP countries by way of the Lomé Agreement. One major problem we have is to ensure that the undertakings in respect of bananas to protect our interests continue to hold after the year 1992. We have been given a number of assurances on these matters, but there remains an underlying fear that the basic philosophy of the single market, that is, the abandonment of any arrangements which inhibit the free circulation of goods among European countries concerned, will prevail eventually to the detriment of Caribbean exports. But of course, there are opportunities which will emerge with the establishment of the single market. Opportunities to increase exports to the community. How this comes out will depend very largely on the extent to which we raise the levels of efficiency and productivity in the Caribbean. An editorial in the Daily Gleaner of December 18, 1990, sounded a clear warning to Jamaica. It spoke of the approaches necessary to deal with a post-1992 unified market in Europe, and went on to state, and I quote, "What appears to be absent is the dynamism in the form of action to reform industries that lack competitive advantage." The evidence is clear. In the matter of trade, at the historic meeting in 1990 of the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which over the years has brought the countries of Eastern and Western Europe together, the Charter of Paris was put forward. It spoke of a new era of democracy, peace, and unity in Europe. And President Mitterrand of France stated, "The 34 states share now a common vision of the world and a common heritage of values." But warnings were issued by a number of leaders at that conference, leaders of both East and West, of the danger that what would emerge from these changes would be a Europe no longer divided between East and West, but between rich and poor. Mikhail Gorbachev, as he initialed the treaty in Moscow, bringing the two Germanys together, felt that this union was a major step towards the realization of his vision of what he calls a common European home. Mrs. Thatcher, on her visit to Czechoslovakia in September 1990, holding out the prospect of membership of the European community to the countries of Eastern Europe, envisaged a community reaching from the North Atlantic to the Soviet Union with a Magna Carta containing the principles of democracy and freedom. There are dangers in some of these developments to the interests of the Caribbean and to the Third World, but there are likely to be opportunities as well. The exploitation of such opportunities will require alertness and a degree of sophistication which will put countries like ours to a very hard test. One immediate benefit to the Caribbean has been a change in the atmosphere, which has come with the ending of the Cold War, which had created serious problems in this region. Soviet spokesmen have been at pains to indicate the changes in their attitudes and policies regarding the Third World, and in particular, the change from the promotion of what they call anti-imperialist regimes and their ideological competition with the United States. Jamaica had an early opportunity of demonstrating our readiness to move into a new era of relationships with Eastern Europe. The visit of a high-level team from the Soviet Union in October 1990 resulted in far-reaching agreements in respect of trade and other forms of economic cooperation. The growing rapprochement between East and West has left Cuba in a somewhat awkward position. That country will inevitably have to face increasing hardships and rising pressures from some of the changes. This will be aggravated as Soviet aid and supplies are reduced, and trade with Eastern Europe runs into difficulty because of the difficulties being experienced by those countries. To bring the matter nearer home, Cuba's efforts to build her tourist trade have led to some concern in the Caribbean about the possibility of serious competition from that source. Caribbean countries, located as they are in close proximity to Cuba and to the United States, which maintains its embargo on that country, are in a delicate position in the light of all these changes. They must fashion realistic policies in the matter of their relations with Cuba. Our countries have perhaps benefited in the past from the restrictions imposed on Cuba. If it now comes to a case of competition in the field of tourism, sugar, or any other area, Caribbean countries must gear themselves for that competition. At the same time, they must look for opportunities for cooperation with a Cuba emerging from isolation. Other countries in the region are doing so, and the English-speaking Caribbean countries will be left out in the cold if they do not find a way of moving with the new currents. It's to be noted that Jamaican entrepreneur John Issa took an early initiative in 1990 by establishing a 250-room hotel in Cuba in anticipation of that country's emergence as a major tourist destination. The Bahamas, the Caribbean's most successful tourist destination, is also engaged in negotiation with the Cuban tourism authorities. And regular charter flights have been instituted between Jamaica and Cuba, and business delegations from Jamaica have been visiting Cuba. Even in this age of surprises, the invasion and annexation of Kuwait by Iraq stood out and drew attention away from the events in Eastern and Western Europe. Developing countries in this situation must now find more effective mechanisms for exploiting the real basis for unity and joint action, while accepting the differences in their circumstances and interests where no such action is possible. But many of them have failed to create that essential requirement for success, namely the full development and deployment of their manpower resources. The need for the establishment of a sophisticated manpower development program was fully examined in the second Grace Foundation lecture. This is an absolute essential for meeting the requirements of the New World Order. It will, among other things, provide that variety of skills which are necessary not only for the processes taking place within countries, but for dealing with the wider world at different levels on which we are required to operate and to compete. In our relations with the world, we must retain, for as long as possible, such advantages as we have enjoyed in our transactions with Europe, and especially the preferential trading arrangements and the provisions of the Lomé Agreement. We have to deepen and widen the relationships between Caribbean countries. We must improve relations with Latin America.
We have to explore the opportunities